You are listening to the Oqual Cycle with Amjad Farouk. And now, Chapter 6, Climate Waves. While growing up in Pakistan during the 1970s, my beloved grandmother would often share with us many memories of her prime years, straddling the 1930s and 1940s, in the midst of a tumultuous period of extreme trials and tribulations, when a complete meltdown in ethnic harmony would trigger the bloody Indian partition and mark the end of British Raj. Among such memorabilia, my grandmother would occasionally tell us that not only did she have to make do with little resources due to crop failures as a result of droughts, but that she also had to confront much hotter summers than what we had seen in our fledgling years. While we deeply shared our agony back then, it would never occur to us that what she was talking about was in fact a recurring theme on our planet rather than just a random event. Over the next several decades, the odyssey of my life would transcend several continents, as it would take me from the heart of Asia to Europe and then to North America. But I never forgot a single moment with my precious grandmother. Today, it should therefore hardly come as a surprise that my photographic memory from almost 50 years earlier made me realize that the anecdotal accounts of my Beji, as I used to call my grandmother with much affection, would resonate with the numerous documented reports of the sweltering heat of the 1930s recorded over North America. Although largely believed to be a man-made ecological disaster, Mother Nature had in fact also collaborated in no small part through unleashing heat waves and droughts to exacerbate the fallout from the so-called Dust Bowl, a decade-long intermittent period of dust storms that billowed over and choked much of North America in fits and starts during the 1930s. In the dazzling light of such accounts of dire climates having befallen our planet some 84 years earlier, I immediately began to feel a sense of déjà vu in the footsteps of my grandmother. Add to that the fact that after immigrating to England during the mid-1980s, I would wake up to piles of snow waiting outside on many winter mornings, to my consternation, just as my father would remind me how lucky I was compared to what he and my uncles had to endure during the 1960s and 1970s. When they were faced with having to shovel feet of snow on virtually every winter morning before they could drive to work, as for instance underscored by the 1963 Big Freeze, the coldest winter spell witnessed on British shores in more than 200 years, and that brought the nation to a virtual standstill for months. Fast forward some 50 years, and heaps of snow waiting outside one's abode on winter mornings have become as rare as diamonds in England. Such a dramatic shift in the English climate is indeed due to rising temperatures that have been witnessed across much of the globe over the past 50 years. However, it seems that today's scorching heat felt by almost everyone across the globe did not just fall out of the sky, but rather it bears parallels to the experiences of my grandmother some 84 years earlier in what was then British India, and those who lived through the Dust Bowl in North America during the 1930s. Of particular note here is the salient observation that the rather hot summers of today and the 1930s were interrupted by a period of a decades-long, relatively temperate climate. Yet, climate scientists seem to sweep such an earth-shattering anecdote under the rug as they attribute the rising temperatures around the globe to an irreversible climate change that they have dubbed global warming. To be sure, the surface temperature of Earth has indeed risen by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since climate records began around 1850, with half of that upsurge having occurred over the past quarter of a century alone. While that may sound ominous, it gets much worse as a politically motivated climate scientist peddle the absurdity of global temperature rising by another 2 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. However, such a dire forecast is predicated on the ridiculous assumption that the current climate trend must be irreversible in that the temperature could only continue to rise linearly as it has done so for at least the past 25 years, if not longer. Yet, nature is inundated with so many phenomena that remind us time and again that what goes up must come down. In fact, fluctuations in temperature are inevitable for a planet that is constantly in flux. Only fools would expect the Earth's surface temperature to hold constant rather than oscillate over time. Admittedly, the Earth is not only beholden to the sinusoidal oscillations of temperature over a day in a year, but it is well documented that our planet experiences a barrage of climate cycles over millennia and megannia in a phenomenon loosely referred to as the Ice Age, with the megannia being the plural form of meganium, meaning a period of 1 million years. In what is called the Little Ice Age, the Earth experienced a sustained period of some 500 years, roughly spanning from 1300 to 1850, during which the global temperature is believed to have dipped by several degrees. With a rhythm of around a millennium, the Little Ice Age was not only the most recent mini ice age that ended less than 200 years ago, but 1816 has also continued to garner attention in that it came to be remembered as the year without a summer. In the wake of the 1815 volcanic eruption at Mount Tambora in Indonesia, with the volcanic ash increasing the Earth's albedo after being blasted into the atmosphere over the course of the year that followed, the global temperature remained depressed during the 1816 summer, with snow falling across many parts of Western Europe and North America, and presumably across many parts of Asia, though I have been unable to track down any reliable historical records. In light of the foregoing argument, it should therefore be hardly surprising that the Earth not only experiences climate cycles over millennia and megannia, but also over shorter decadal and centennial timescales. Long story short, the rising trend in global temperature witnessed over the past 50 years is in no uncertain terms due to the climate rhythm that oscillates in sync with the Oqual cycle over a period of 84 years in a similar fashion to the sinusoidal oscillations of temperature over the course of a day or a year. Notably, such an 84-year climate cycle could well be the missing link between Uranus and its impact on the affairs of Earthlings as embodied in the Oqual theory. In particular, Uranus appears to exert a subtle control over human civilization by virtue of its ability to modulate the terrestrial climate in a sinusoidal fashion, in sync with the Oqual cycle, in a manner akin to the annual climate cycle dictated by the orbiting of Earth around the Sun. In fact, the unprecedented rise in global temperature witnessed over the past quarter of a century is in no small part due to the Uranian spell on our planet, and as such, global warming is expected to not only plateau out, but also head south as the current Oqual cycle draws to a close over the next decade or so. Likewise, the wrath of natural disasters from droughts through flooding to storms with an increasing frequency and intensity seen over the past quarter of a century also seems to be largely due to the cyclical flux of our planet undergoing a self-cleansing process under the watchful eye of an Oqual cycle rather than a direct consequence of human activities. Although the likes of earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, and wildfires are beyond the scope of this maiden edition, a rudimentary analysis nonetheless reaches the same conclusion, that their frequency and intensity also ebb and flow in sync with the progression of Oqual cycle. While the drummed-up specter of global warming seems to be nothing more than a hyperbole hatched by devious actors around the globe in order to advance their propaganda, there appears to be nevertheless a seemingly upward trend in global temperature over the long run, though far from being anywhere near as apocalyptic as that forecast by climate scientists. Taken together, the terrestrial climate appears to oscillate over a period of 84 years in sync with the Oqual cycle so as to produce a lower order harmonic of the daily and annual temperature cycles. To shed further light on this timely phenomenon, let us divide our ongoing discussion under the following sections. 6.1 Temperature 6.2 Droughts 6.3 Floods 6.4 Storms 6.5 Climate Ganda. Section 6.1 Temperature. To test the hypothesis that the rising trend in global temperature witnessed over the past 50 years is due to the climate rhythm that marches in lockstep with the Oqual cycle, I analyzed the temperature data stretching at least as far back as the 1870s from a number of observatories scattered across the United Kingdom and publicly available courtesy of the Met Office. While data from all of these observatories displayed remarkable climate oscillations over periods roughly spanning 84 years, the contrast was particularly notable for the data from the Stornoway Station, located on an island off the northwestern coast of Scotland, presumably due to its remote location from urban centers such that the artificial temperature fluctuations due to what is called the urban heat island effect are minimized. Needless to say, the temperature data from the Stornoway Station are being used here as a proxy to probe how the global climate foxtrots with the Oqual cycle. Such analysis reveals that the daily high temperature displays a remarkable wave-like behavior that has continued to oscillate in sync with the Oqual cycle since 1871, a period that encompasses virtually all of a sixth, 1871 to 1954, and much of seventh, 1955 to 2038, Aquania. In particular, the daily high temperature seemingly undergoes a steady drop over the first half, 1871 to 1912, of previous and sixth Aquanium, and then steadily rises during the second half, 1913 to 1954, virtually in sync with the progression of the Oqual rhythm. A similar trend is observed for the current and seventh Aquanium, with the daily high temperature beginning to head south around 1955 and then turning north almost exactly at the midpoint in 1997. Unsurprisingly, such an oscillatory trend over a period of around 84 years is also a hallmark of daily low temperature as well as daily mean temperature. It is, however, noteworthy that there appears to be a slight uptick in the thermometer since 1871 as simulated by diagonal sinusoidal models. In particular, such a rising trend in temperature is significantly more pronounced for the daily lows relative to the daily highs. That the rise in daily lows has outpaced the corresponding rise in daily highs is evidence that the overall rise in global temperature since 1871 is largely due to the Earth getting less colder than more warmer. This notion is further corroborated by the daily temperature differential that has displayed a precipitously falling sinusoidal trend since 1871 and is poised to continue to do so over the course of the next Oqual cycle. Importantly, the oscillatory behavior of temperature is exquisitely mirrored by a remarkably similar pattern in the number of air frost days. The days on which the air temperature is equal to or lower than 0 degrees Celsius. Though such a sinusoidal trend appears to be somewhat out of phase with the progression of Oqual cycle. Needless to say, the 84-year cyclical variation of temperature around the globe does not have to be perfectly synchronized with the Oqual cycle due to an interplay between the local climate and astronomical factors. Notwithstanding such anomalies, the data presented herein unequivocally suggest that the Earth apparently cools down during the first half of Oqual cycle and then begins to warm up during the second half. In other words, the Earth experiences what is called the temperature aqua cycle over a period of 84 years that appears to be a lower order harmonic of the daily and annual temperature cycles. Of particular note is the observation that such multi-decadal oscillation of global temperature produces a 42-year cooling period in sync with the first half of Oqual cycle, followed by a 42-year warming spell during the second half. However, the warming up during the second half outstrips the amplitude of the drop during the first half, such that the Earth is overall heating up due to what appear to be astronomical factors rather than human activities. In the context of our recent past, the Earth underwent a cooling period during the first half, 1955 to 1996, of the current Aquanium, and it is currently experiencing a warming spell over the course of the second half, 1997 to 2038. Accordingly, a rising trend in global temperature is expected to continue over the next decade or so before it begins to head south, just as the current Oqual cycle bids farewell in about a decade or so. Nevertheless, the Earth is overall getting warmer, but it is a far cry from what the hyped-up climate forecasts have us believe. Given that the Earth experienced a little ice age between 1300 to 1850, our planet undergoing the current bout of global warming should therefore be hardly surprising, as it is not only trying to reclaim the warmer temperatures it once enjoyed, but another mini ice age likely awaits on the other side that should once again revert the global temperature to its long-term average. It is noteworthy that the cyclical nature of global temperature over a multi-decadal time scale has been well documented for decades. However, the data presented herein suggests that such a multi-decadal temperature oscillation more or less occurs in lockstep with the progression of Oqual cycle. Taken together, it seems that the sharp uptick observed in global temperature over the past quarter of a century is transitory rather than persistent due to the modulation of terrestrial climate by astronomical factors in a sinusoidal fashion such that it oscillates in lockstep with the Oqual cycle. How does one reconcile the fact that the ongoing global warming is due to astronomical factors rather than carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions? Although gigatons of carbon dioxide are being released into the atmosphere each year due to the combustion of fossil fuels, such emissions nevertheless pale in comparison to what is being discharged through natural processes such as cellular respiration by living organisms on land and in oceans. In fact, much of CO2 released into the atmosphere is immediately recycled back via carbon sinks such as topsoil, rainforests, rocks, and oceans. It should therefore be hardly surprising that the atmospheric CO2 levels have more or less remained constant over the millennial timescale. Nevertheless, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 has precipitously risen by 40% from around 300 ppm in 1900 to 420 ppm today. Out of every million molecules of all gases that make up the atmosphere, 420 of those belong to CO2, or 420 parts per million. While such an upsurge in the atmospheric level of CO2 over the past century or so is significant, few have the wisdom to question whether it is beneficial or harmful to the planet and its inhabitants, plants and animals alike. Rather, climate scientists assume a priori that the rising levels of atmospheric CO2 must necessarily be harmful in that they are believed to correlate with a rise in global temperature due to their own intuition and biased views arising from their conflict of interest and further fueled by herd mentality and peer pressure. Alas, correlation does not necessarily imply causation. Even if one assumes that there is a correlation between a rise in global temperature and a rise in atmospheric CO2, they are still left with establishing the causality, or solving the cause-effect equation. Rather than being the cause, the latter could well be the effect or symptom. This problem essentially amounts to the chicken or egg paradox. Did the chicken lay the egg, or did the egg produce the chicken? Simply put, the apparent rise in atmospheric CO2 could well follow rather than precede a rise in global temperature, which itself could be due to one or more of the natural climate cycles known to occur over decades, centuries, millennia, and even millennia. An overlay of multi-centennial data indeed suggests that delta CO2, or the annual rate of change in CO2 emissions, has not only by and large oscillated in a perfect harmony with the central England temperature since around 1700, but that a rise in delta CO2 also somewhat appears to lag the corresponding rise in the thermometer. In other words, it is the rise in global temperature that begets a corresponding rise in delta CO2, and a drop in the thermometer also leads to a drop in delta CO2. In particular, while the temperature over the past several decades has been rising, delta CO2 has been experiencing a slump almost mirroring the trend in the thermometer over the same time frame due to what appears to be a multi-decadal lag between the cause, or temperature rise, and effect, or CO2 rise. That this is so lends unequivocal evidence that the greenhouse gas is unlikely to be the cause of the ongoing global warming, in agreement with previous studies on Antarctic ice cores indicating that the rise in CO2 lagged the rise in temperature by centuries. This notion is further corroborated by the fact that there appears to be an overall negative correlation between global warming since around 1700 and CO2 emissions, as probed by Pearson's correlation coefficient. Thus, although the global temperature has been on a rising trajectory since around 1700, the time-resolved Pearson's correlation coefficient displays an overall negative slope over the same time frame. It is noteworthy that there is a lack of discernible oscillatory trend that might be expected to move in lockstep with the progression of Oqual cycle in the central England temperature. This is due to the low resolution and sometimes indirect measurement of temperature over central England over the course of centuries, not to mention that such data do not refer to a well-defined location, as is the case with the temperature data from the Stoneway station discussed earlier, but rather represent an average over a much larger region. Notwithstanding such drawbacks, the rather steep rise in central England temperature over the past 50 years is exquisitely paralleled, if not overshadowed, by an equally impressive upsurge observed during the first half of the 18th century. Such a burst of global warming observed during that earlier period, roughly spanning 1700 to 1750, occurred well before the modern industrialization of our planet in the midst of the Little Ice Age that ended around 1850. Surely that earlier global warming in our recent past must have been driven by astronomical factors rather than due to the combustion of fossil fuels concomitant with the release of CO2 into the atmosphere. Why anyone would therefore attribute the current trend in global warming to anthropogenic factors is anyone's guess. Nevertheless, a neutral observer would conclude that the hyped-up threat of the current trend in global warming is due to either a knee-jerk reaction at best, or at worst, a propaganda engineered to exploit the masses and rally them to a new round of feeding frenzy on a roster of new technologies and consumer products fraudulently labeled as environment-friendly. In actuality, such bogus products from electric cars to solar panels represent a devil in disguise that will only plunge our planet into a deeper crisis in the decades and generations to come. As a rule of thumb, no technology is good for the well-being of our environment. It is all about a trade-off between the benefits versus the harms of a product. Those looking for an environment-friendly technology should rather cut down on their toxic addiction to overconsumption, as it will not only alleviate the suffering of the planet, but also boost their own health and wealth. Section 6.2 Droughts. In light of the temperature aqua cycle discussed earlier, one would assume that parts of the globe would be marred by dry spells during the second half of an Oqual cycle when the Earth begins to transiently heat up, producing a multi-decadal warmer period compared to the first half. Notably, warmer temperatures promote evaporation of surface water, thereby drying out the soil in regions with low precipitation, causing vegetations to die out, and even making the topsoil becoming dislodged during high winds, with the risk of turning the otherwise healthy land into a desert. Consistent with this argument, the globe has indeed been caught in a quagmire of what seems to be a perpetual spell of severe droughts over the past couple of decades, the like of which we have rarely encountered in our lifetime. Although many are quick to lay the blame on irreversible climate change for such a crisis, the crux of the matter is that this is most likely due to the Earth being in a cyclical flux, and as such, wetter days are just around the corner. In particular, human civilization has encountered protracted but transitory dry spells a la ongoing droughts time and again, as they appear to be a hallmark of the second half of Oqual cycle. This view is supported by the fact that the rainfall in the Scottish northwest seemingly displays an 84-year cyclical rhythm, though somewhat out of phase with the progression of Oqual cycle. It is notable that the rainfall steadily increases during the first half of Oqual cycle and then reverses its course during the second half, producing a quasi-sinusoidal pattern with a periodicity of around 84 years. In the context of such a cyclical variation observed in rainfall, the Oqual cycle can be viewed as a perpetual tale of two halves. A wet period followed by a dry spell, with each lasting some 42 years. Such an alternate spell of wet and dry periods over the course of Oqual cycle suggests that the second half is much more likely to experience the severe and extended bouts of drought in agreement with the spell of temperature aqua cycle. Consistent with this rationale, the drought conditions indeed tend to wane during the first half of Oqual cycle and then wax during the second half as probed by the so-called PAMA Drought Index, or PDI, for the American Southwest. On the basis of broader PDI analysis, such a drought aqua cycle alternating between an overall wet period followed by an overall dry spell occurring more or less in sync with the progression of an Oqual cycle also appears to hold true across other regions of the globe. One should therefore be hardly surprised to learn that being in the midst of the second half 1997 to 2038 of the current Aquanium, many parts of the world are either embroiled in once-in-a-lifetime drought or have already gone through a fair share of their own dry wrath of nature. Let us delve a little deeper into the second halves of the last three Aquania in order to further evaluate the generality of the drought aqua cycle. Subsection titled Droughts have hitherto been a hallmark of the second half 1997 to 2038 of the current and seventh Aquanium 1955 to 2038. Since drought is concomitant with crop failures, it often serves as a breeding ground for violent conflicts. Indeed, one of the major triggers for the Syrian civil war was what is believed to be the most severe drought ever recorded on Syrian soil between 2006 to 2011, with the water levels of rivers such as the Tigris and Euphrates having dropped dangerously low. That Syrian drought at the outset of the second half of the current Aquanium resulted in mass migration of people from rural areas to urban centers, thereby causing price inflation and sparking social unrest that continues to this day. Elsewhere around the globe, the Australians have had to deal with their own prolonged dry spell called the millennium drought 2001 to 2009 in the recent past, just as the second half of the current Aquanium rang in. Since 2019, much of Brazilian south has been gripped by a severe bout of drought, with the water level in Rio Parana having dipped by as much as 30 feet below average in some parts. For the past couple of decades, much of the Indian North has also been experiencing drought-like conditions, with groundwater in rapid decline, coupled with repetitive bouts of low rainfall year after year, such that many Indian scholars are increasingly concerned that they could well have their own Dust Bowl in the making. Such a prophecy may well come to fruition as the current Oqual cycle draws to a close over the next decade or so, should the arable land continue to be overused against the backdrop of limited precipitation. Across the Himalayas, China may have proved itself as the world's largest manufacturing powerhouse, head and shoulders above all other nations, but such an industrial feat has come with a huge price tag, as the Asian giant finds itself increasingly becoming dry and short of water supplies in order to continue marching towards its destiny of dethroning America and taking up the baton of global leadership. For its part, America is hardly a stranger to droughts. Since the outset of 21st century, the American Southwest has been under protracted drought conditions, with Lake Mead, the nation's largest reservoir supplying water to 25 million people and powering the hydroelectric turbines of the Hoover Dam, having dropped to one-third of its full capacity in 2022. Although what has been loosely termed the American mega drought is being attributed to irreversible climate change, the ongoing dry spell in the American Southwest is nevertheless transitory rather than persistent, due to our planet being in a cyclical flux, with wetter conditions poised to return across much of the globe in about a decade or so, in line with the spell of Oqual cycle. Next subsection, protracted dry spells hamstrung the second half 1913 to 1954 of the previous and sixth Aquanium, 1871 to 1954. Some 84 years before the ongoing American mega drought, a far worse episode of a severe decade-long drought in the form of what came to be called the Dust Bowl befell North America during much of the 1930s in the midst of the second half of the previous and sixth Aquanium. What was arguably the worst ecological disaster in the nation's history, the Dust Bowl billowed over and choked much of North America. Triggered by the conversion of mega acres of arid grassland into arable land in the American Southwest, coupled with the deep plowing resulting in the loss of protective grasses against the backdrop of a prolonged period of low rainfall, the dislodged topsoil quickly turned dry, becoming vulnerable to being tossed up into the air and blown away by high winds over hundreds of miles. The resulting dust storms, powered by a severe bout of drought across much of the American Southwest, would kill thousands of people and displace millions more as the Dust Bowl conspired to exacerbate the pain and suffering unleashed upon the nation by the Great Depression. Across the other side of the globe, the Australians did not fare any better, as they had to endure a catastrophe of their own in what since then has been referred to as the World War II drought, 1937 to 1945, during the second half of the previous Aquanium. Add to that the Northwest China famine, 1928 to 1930, sparked by one of the worst droughts of the second half of the previous Aquanium, as it led to widespread famine and claimed the lives of as many as 10 million people. While documented accounts are hard to come by, the northern Indian peninsula, being frequently prone to dry spells, was also likely beset by severe droughts during the second half of the previous Aquanium, as per anecdotal accounts of my beloved grandmother. Born in 1901, the year during which Queen Victoria took her last breath, my grandmother once confided in us how she and everyone else around her had to occasionally make do with the pakra weed, or caltrop, in lieu of more conventional grains such as wheat or millet during her prime years, just as the world around her was stifled by the Great Depression during the 1930s. With a minimal dependence on moisture and taxonomically classified as a tribulus terrestris and commonly identified by various names that allude to the shape of his hooked burr, such as caltrop or goat's head, the pakra weed is a master of drought conditions and thrives on the driest of soils where all else fails. The dire plight of my grandmother having to substitute the horrible pakra for the much more palatable wheat and millet speaks volumes about what the dire nutritional straits many Indians must have encountered across much of the northern Indian peninsula during the second half of the previous Aquanium. This is particularly notable given that my grandmother hailed from a relatively prosperous Rajput clan renowned for its land ownership and agricultural prowess, with Rajput being a portmanteau of Raja or king and Put or descendant. One therefore wonders that if the mighty Rajputs were forced to survive on the Pakra then the nutritional predicament facing ordinary Indians must have been multiples worse. This school of thought is further corroborated by the 1943 Bengal famine that claimed the lives of millions due to crop failures, though that human tragedy is believed to be in no small part exacerbated by the British colonialists diverting food away in the most devious manner imaginable from Indian civilians to British soldiers fighting World War II. Out of fear that snatching food from Indians in broad daylight could trigger social unrest and a dreadful rebellion, the notorious economist John Maynard Keynes, working for the British Treasury, devised a cunning plan to have the Bank of England print huge sums of money such that it would price ordinary Indians out of the market through inflation, leaving the British soldiers to gorge on the spoils without firing a shot. Alas, what goes around comes around. The sacks of printed money returned home in droves not long after the Vilayati colonial rule on Indian soil ended in 1947, and soon thereafter kick-started a deadly bout of inflation on British shores during the 1950s, causing the pound to plunge against the dollar. In 1861, at the outbreak of the American Civil War when the British Empire was rising fast, 1 GBP spiked to 10 USD. In 1939, prior to the outbreak of World War II, 1 GBP equaled 5 USD. In 1950, after all the dust from World War II had settled, with America having dethroned Britain for the global supremacy, 1 GBP barely garnered 3 USD. In 2022, almost 84 years after GBP last held its own against USD, the pound hit all but parity with the dollar for the first time ever in history. What a difference one round of Oqual cycle makes, with the GBP having lost 80% of its value against the USD since 1939. 2 rounds of Oqual cycle make an even bigger difference, with the GBP having lost 90% of its value against the USD since 1861. No wonder then that even the poorest of Americans are now beginning to salivate at the prospect of their dream of meeting Blighty King becoming a reality as the fortunes of Dollar King continue to bloat. But before hitchhiking across the pond to the other side of the Atlantic, they must first make amends with the ever-deepening American mega-drought threatening to overshadow the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, befalling North America in the midst of the second half of the previous Aquanium. Although that is unlikely to pan out, such a calamity is nevertheless inevitable once every 84 years during the second half of Oqual cycle. Next subsection, prolonged dry periods crippled the second half 1829 to 1870 of the fifth Aquanium, 1787 to 1870. Some 84 years prior to the Dust Bowl, the American Southwest was struck by an equally devastating prolonged dry period, aptly named Civil War drought, during much of the 1850s and 1860s in the midst of the second half of the fifth Aquanium. In particular, the Civil War drought is notable for not only weighing heavily on the European immigrants heading from east to west looking for greener pastures, but it also pushed the American bison to near extinction as the foraging opportunities became squeezed due to fierce competition between wild herbivores and domesticated animals. Additionally, the crop failures for what was then a largely agrarian society only exacerbated the woes of Americans. Needless to say, the Civil War drought was a major trigger for its namesake conflict that all but sliced the nation into two. In a magnitude comparable to the Civil War drought, a protracted drought across much of Australian South during the 1850s and 1860s in the midst of the second half of the fifth Aquanium has also been documented. Likewise, a severe drought is believed to have befallen much of Europe during the 1840s, leading to extensive famine and sparking a series of socio-political upheavals throughout the continent in what came to be collectively called the European Revolutions, 1848 to 1849. While Ireland's Great Famine 1845 to 1852 was caused by the potato blight, the Irish misery was exacerbated by widespread shortage of food across Europe due to the drought, such that large quantities of food continued to be looted of the country by England. The whole of Ireland then being a part of the United Kingdom, and the Irish Republic only becoming independent in 1922. In China, severe drought conditions during the 1850s and 1860s led to widespread famine and the outbreak of a large-scale civil war through rebellions such as the Taiping Rebellion and the Neon Rebellion that together significantly weakened the Qing dynasty's grip on power, just as the fifth Aquanium drew to a close. While there are no reliable data, I suspect that one of the major causes that fueled the 1857 Indian Mutiny against the British colonialists must have been the millions of undernourished mouths due to widespread drought and crop failures on the Indian peninsula during the second half of the fifth Aquanium. This view is supported by multiple bouts of famines across the northern Indian peninsula during much of the second half of the fifth Aquanium. Such hard times were additionally capped by Indian Great Famine 1876 to 1878 at the dawn of sixth Aquanium, which is believed to have resulted in crop failures across much of the Indian South, resulting in the death of as many as 10 million people. Next subsection, a relatively wet period is waiting on the horizon. Some of the most severe and protracted droughts that the world has experienced in recorded history have almost always occurred during the second half of Oqual cycle. This should be hardly surprising given that the Earth begins to heat up during the second half of Oqual cycle, thereby favoring dry conditions. Although the likelihood of severe droughts are multiples greater during the second half of Oqual cycle, exceptions to this rule are nevertheless expected like any other natural phenomenon. For example, one of the worst droughts to occur on Australian soil was the so-called Federation Drought, 1895 to 1902, that reared its ugly head during the first half of the previous Aquanium. Still, the ongoing bouts of drought around the globe are a hallmark of the second half of Oqual cycle as we currently find in one, rather than due to irreversible climate change. Nevertheless, one must not disregard the fact that the quadrupling of global population, coupled with the ever more crowding of urban centers due to migration over the past century, has put ever more stress on nature and its resources. For the most part, the falling levels of water in rivers and lakes across the globe are transitory, though they may not return to their prior highs anytime soon due to the overloaded demand placed upon them by our consumer culture. All told, a relatively wet multi-decadal period waiting on the horizon should put an end to our ongoing drought woes as the current Aquanium draws to a close in about a decade or so. Section 6.3 Floods. In light of the temperature aqua cycle discussed earlier, one could argue that parts of the globe would be deluged by severe flooding during the second half of Oqual cycle when the Earth begins to transiently heat up, producing a multi-decadal warmer period compared to the first half. Notably, the relatively warmer temperatures triggered the melting of frozen water reservoirs, such as the glaciers and ice caps, causing rivers to overflow and inundate nearby communities. Additionally, warmer temperatures produce warmer air, which can hold more water vapor, thereby gaining the potential to unleash heavy and sustained rains, which subsequently conspire with the melting of frozen water reservoirs to exacerbate flooding of inhabited areas. In line with this school of thought, the globe has indeed been mired in what seems to be a perennial stretch of severe floods over the past couple of decades, the like of which we have rarely encountered in our lifetime. Although many are quick to lay the blame on irreversible climate change for such a crisis, it seems that this is most likely due to the Earth being in a cyclical flux, and as such, relatively floodless days are just around the corner. In particular, severe flooding appears to be a hallmark of the second half of the Oqual cycle in a manner akin to the recurring spell of droughts discussed earlier. More specifically, the severity of flooding diminishes during the first half of the Oqual cycle, but accelerates during the second half in what can be envisioned as the flood aqua cycle. Since there is no quantitative barometer, one is therefore left with qualitative benchmarks such as the loss of life and property, coupled with the extent of land mass becoming inundated to gauge the severity of such flooding. On the basis of such a yardstick, let us take a qualitative look at the second halves of the last three aquania in order to test the generality of the flood aqua cycle. It should, however, be noted that the flood aqua cycle is primarily concerned with natural floods stemming from heavy rains and melting of frozen water reservoirs rather than due to storms, which are the subject of next section. Likewise, man-made flood disasters resulting exclusively from dam failures due to the bursting of their banks are also not accounted for by the Oqual cycle. Subsection titled Deadly Floods have hitherto been a hallmark of the second half 1997 to 2038 of the current and seventh aquanium 1955 to 2038. With a widespread radius and ravaging so many nations across much of Western Europe, the 2021 European floods underpinned the extreme rage that Mother Nature is capable of unleashing upon humanity during the second half of the Oqual cycle. Although United Kingdom is not particularly prone to flooding, it is nevertheless vulnerable to severe inundation during the second half of Oqual cycle. In what is known as the 2004 Boscastle flood, the county of Cornwall in the British southwest would witness a bout of extreme flooding described by the pundits as once-in-a-lifetime event, though hardly surprising given that it occurred during the second half of the current and seventh aquanium. However, the 2007 United Kingdom floods would overshadow the severity of what was encountered 3 years earlier in Cornwall, with rivers such as the Thames in London, the Cherwell in Oxford, and the Ock in Abingdon bursting their banks and inundating much of Britain as if it were a scene out of a horror movie, with the county of Gloucestershire becoming reduced to a temporal island due to the overflowing of the River Severn and the River Avon. On the other side of the Atlantic, torrential rains in the mountainous regions led to deadly mudslides and flooded much of the coastal state of Barga in the north of Venezuela in what is called the 1999 Barga mudslide, leaving deca-thousands dead and ecto-thousands homeless, along with annihilation of much of the infrastructure and the livelihoods of local communities. To Venezuela's north, severe flooding decimated many Caribbean nations, including in particular the Hispaniola island, divided between modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic in what are known as the 2004 Hispaniola floods. On the other side of the globe, the second half of the current Aquanium has also kept the record keepers busy with the new floods shattering centuries-old milestones. While hardly a stranger to run-of-the-mill floods with the Himalayan glaciers capping its northern tip and the Indus River flowing through its spine on its way to meet the Arabian Sea, Pakistan is nevertheless prone to severe inundation during the second half of Oqual cycle. And so most living Pakistanis would get to taste their first rendezvous horribilis with inundation in the form of the 2010 Pakistan floods that would go on to kill thousands, leave millions homeless, and cause enormous damage to crops. Over a decade later, the nation would be met with an even more severe blow of nature called the 2022 Pakistan floods that would inundate a third of the country's landmass and in doing so ravage properties and infrastructure on an unimaginable scale, leave decamillions homeless, and claim the lives of thousands either through a direct hit or indirectly through the deadly waterborne diseases such as diarrhea, cholera, malaria, and dengue. While one half of Pakistan attributes such flooding from hell to irreversible climate change, the other half believes that it is a taste of heavenly retribution being handed out to them due to their excesses and transgressions amassed over the past couple of decades. In the context of Oqual cycle, the latter half appears to be closer to the truth, with the former acting rather like my goats that I trained to follow the herd while growing up in Pakistan during the 1980s. Let us shift gears from Pakistan to what was once East Pakistan. Being a flood-prone region due to the confluence of hundreds of rivers running through its heartland to reach the sacred waters of the Bay of Bengal, coupled with being in the direct path of heavy monsoon rains, Bangladesh can be easily awarded the dubious title of the flood nation of the world, as well as the much more prestigious one of the Mecca of rivers. Unsurprisingly then, the flood nation would encounter its first deadly bout of what are called the 1998 Bangladesh floods during the second half of the current Aquanium. A calamity in which thousands were killed, millions were left homeless, and much of the nation's infrastructure and crops were ravaged. The deadly floods would return to Bangladesh in 2004 and again in 2022, each time tearing apart much of the nation as if Yajuj and Majuj, or Gog and Magog, had returned to ravage the Mecca of rivers. Nevertheless, Bangladeshis can go to sleep rest assured that Yajuj and Majuj are safely locked behind a wall of mountain that they cannot breach until they become believers by uttering Inshallah. Still, what happens in Bangladesh rarely stays in Bangladesh. Due to being abutted by India on virtually all sides but its southern coastline, flooding in Bangladesh almost always spills over into India. For its part, India is no stranger to its own direct rendezvous with inundation. In what are called the 2013 North India floods, much of northern India would be battered by once-in-a-lifetime torrential rains and devastating floods that claimed the lives of thousands, destroyed crops and livelihoods of millions, and ravaged infrastructure on a large scale. An equally devastating bout of floods would return to India in 2019, affecting not only the north, but much of the south of the country as well. To India's east, the so-called 2011 Southeast Asian floods disrupted the lives of decamillions on a scale never seen in a lifetime, from Myanmar to Philippines, to the tune of tremendous loss of life and property. While floods have been part and parcel of Chinese civilization since the beginning of times, they have been particularly devastating during the second half of Oqual cycle. In the most recent episode, the Asian giant was struck by the deadly 2010 China floods during the second half of the current Aquanium. That once-in-a-lifetime calamity claimed the lives of thousands, left decamillions homeless, damaged extensive infrastructure, and destroyed crops on a large scale. The 2010 wave of severe inundation was particularly troubling given that China had already been struck by a comparable calamity a little more than a decade earlier, almost in parallel with the beginning of the second half of the current Aquanium through the so-called 1998 Yangtze floods. Next subsection. Widespread flooding wreaked havoc during the second half 1913 to 1954 of the previous and sixth Aquanium, 1871 to 1954. Some 84 years prior to the 2010 China floods, the Asian giant would be met by the so-called 1931 China floods during the second half of the previous and sixth Aquanium. That catastrophe is believed to be the deadliest flooding in recorded history, as it claimed the lives of millions and decimated the livelihoods of decamillions more, as it wreaked havoc on much of the then nation of some 500 million people. The Asian giant would be struck again by once-in-a-lifetime natural disaster in the form of the 1935 Yangtze floods that would claim the lives of hecto-thousands and displace millions in the midst of a decade marred by economic depression, severe famine, and civil war. On the other side of the globe, the Central Americans would get to taste a once-in-a-lifetime inundation of their own in what came to be called the 1949 Eastern Guatemalan floods, the like of which have not been witnessed since on the shores of Central America. Back on Asian soil, Pakistan tasted its first ever rage of Mother Nature as an independent nation when heavy monsoon rains caused the river Ravi to overflow, thereby sparking severe inundation across much of Punjab and Sindh provinces in what came to be called the 1950 Pakistan floods. A calamity from the second half of the previous Aquanium, only surpassed by the recent floods in 2010 and 2022 during the second half of the current Aquanium. To Pakistan's east, India would encounter an unforgettable calamity of its own, remembered as the 1943 Madras floods that resulted in widespread loss of life and property and shook the Indian society to the core as it had barely recovered from the equally devastating 1924 Kerala floods. It was not only in India that the bloody floods would test the resolve of the British colonialists, but they would also come home with a vengeance during the second half of the previous Aquanium. In what is known as the 1928 Thames flood, British icons such as the Westminster Hall and the London Underground would become severely inundated, the like of which the British capital has never experienced since. As the previous Aquanium drew to a close, the British southwest would be blasted by yet another rare inundation in the form of the 1952 Lynmouth flood that caused a substantial loss of life and property in the village of Lynmouth in the county of Devon. Next subsection. Destructive floods ravaged the planet during the second half 1829 to 1870 of the fifth Aquanium, 1787 to 1870. A little more than one full turn of Oqual cycle earlier, United Kingdom would be severely deluged by the so-called 1852 Holmfirth flood in the midst of the second half of the fifth Aquanium. A calamity that resulted from the River Holme, located in the metropolitan county of West Yorkshire, bursting its bank after being pounded with days of torrential rain. On the other side of the globe, the British Dominion of Australia did not fare any better, even though it is to flooding what sunlight is to a vampire. In what came to be called the 1852 Gundagai flood, heavy rains caused the Murrumbidgee River to burst its banks, resulting in severe inundation of the town of Gundagai in New South Wales. The raging torrents swept whole homes in its path, causing many residents to cling onto trees for days as they fought for their lives. What has since then remained the deadliest inundation in Australia's recorded history, the 1852 Gundagai flood literally turned the pueblo into a ghost town as it wiped out nearly half of the town's population of some 250 European settlers and swept away most of the properties. And many of those who survived did so due to the heroics of Aboriginal men who used their canoes to launch multiple rescue missions in treacherous waters. That is all the more remarkable given that the Aborigines had been decimated by the introduction of infectious diseases such as smallpox and measles by Europeans. To Australia's north, China is believed to have been deluged by what came to be called the 1851 Yellow River floods during the second half of the fifth Aquanium, a deadly disaster that resulted from the torrential rains causing the Yellow River to overflow and burst its banks, and in doing so leading to destruction on a scale rarely witnessed up till then. With no action taken by the government to avert the repeat of the disaster, the torrential rains would cause the Yellow River to burst its banks again in 1855, and then again in 1887, each time ravaging the nation like a monster from hell. While it is likely that many other nations around the globe also bore the brunt of severe flooding due to heavy rains and the melting of frozen water reservoirs during the second half of the fifth Aquanium, this view nevertheless remains speculative due to the lack of documented accounts. Next subsection. A relatively floodless period is waiting on the horizon. The ongoing bouts of severe flooding around the globe are a hallmark of the second half of Oqual cycle as we currently find in one, rather than due to irreversible climate change. Indeed, some of the deadliest floods that the world has experienced in recorded history have almost always occurred during the second half of Oqual cycle. This should be hardly surprising given that the Earth begins to heat up during the second half of Oqual cycle, thereby triggering the melting of frozen water reservoirs, causing rivers to overflow and inundate nearby communities. Additionally, warmer temperatures during the second half of Oqual cycle lead to rare but deadly bouts of torrential rains. Needless to say, a synergistic cooperation between the melting of frozen waters and torrential rains is a perfect recipe for unleashing severe inundation during the second half of Oqual cycle. Still, severe flooding may also occur during the first half of Oqual cycle, though this is an exception to the rule. In particular, nations prone to frequent flooding such as Bangladesh are unlikely to conform to the flood aqua cycle. Indeed, due to its precarious geographical location and being a gravitational well that pulls the waters of so many rivers beginning their journey upstream in far-flung mountains, Bangladesh gets torn apart by a deadly flood once every decade on average, rather than once in a lifetime. For example, over the course of the current Aquanium, Bangladesh has been crippled time and again by deadly floods in 1974, 1987, 1988, 1993, 1998, 2004, and 2022. Sadly, such a frequent cycle does not bode well for the economic well-being of Bangladesh, in that the nation gets pummeled by a new bout of severe flooding before it has even had the chance to recover from the previous one. While Bangladesh must continue to shower in uninvited waters, most other nations can look forward to a relatively floodless multi-decadal period ahead as the current Aquanium draws to a close in about a decade or so. Section 6.4 Storms. Storms arise due to the disturbance of the atmosphere with strong winds that are usually accompanied by heavy rainfall, thunder, lightning, or even snow. Such storms release their energy through various forms such as tornadoes, cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons. When the core of the storm spins on its vertical axis, forming a funnel-shaped column of wind moving forward, it is called a tornado. When the core of the storm spins around a central area with low atmospheric pressure as it moves forward, it is called a cyclone. Cyclones with a wind speed greater than 74 miles per hour are broadly categorized as hurricanes or typhoons, depending on whether they form in the Western Hemisphere or Eastern Hemisphere respectively. In light of the temperature-aqua cycle discussed earlier, one could postulate that parts of the globe would become more vulnerable to being battered by storms during the second half of Oqual cycle when the Earth begins to transiently heat up, producing a multi-decadal warmer period compared to the first half. Since warmer temperatures promote evaporation of water, the storms traveling overhead gain inertia as they pull in water vapor from the warmer oceans below, leading to the formation of more powerful winds and heavy rains. A toxic combination that does not bode well when such storms make a landfall in inhabited areas. In agreement with this notion, the globe has indeed been mired in what seems to be a perennial stretch of deadly storms witnessed over the past couple of decades. Although many are quick to lay the blame on irreversible climate change for such a crisis, it seems that this is most likely due to the Earth being in a cyclical flux, and as such, relatively calm days are just around the corner. In particular, severe storms appear to be a hallmark of the second half of Oqual cycle in a manner akin to the recurring spell of droughts and floods discussed earlier. This view is supported by quantitative analysis of data on hurricanes recorded over the North Atlantic Ocean over the course of the 6th and 7th Aquania. Notably, the hurricane frequency follows an 84-year oscillatory pattern more or less in lockstep with the progression of Oqual cycle. In other words, the number of hurricanes recorded during each calendar year drops over the first half of Oqual cycle to reach a minimum, and then begins to increase during the second half to hit a maximum. A similar trend is also observed for the hurricane severity as brought by the so-called accumulated cyclone energy. Notably, the wave-like behavior of hurricane severity is somewhat out of phase with the Oqual cycle, which is also the case with the oscillation of hurricane frequency. Such a lag between the oscillation of frequency and severity of hurricanes recorded over the North Atlantic Ocean and the Oqual cycle is most likely due to an interplay between the local climate and astronomical factors. Notwithstanding such anomalies, it seems that the storm severity wanes during the first half of Oqual cycle, but waxes during the second half across the globe in what can be envisioned as the storm aqua cycle. Being in the midst of the second half 1997 to 2038 of the current and 7th Aquanium, no one should therefore be aghast at having been clobbered by a perpetual stream of destructive storms around the globe over the past couple of decades or so. Making a landfall in the U.S. state of Florida as it blew away infrastructure and wiped out whole communities, the 2022 Hurricane Ian was the latest reminder of the deadly spell of the second half of Oqual cycle. Barely a week earlier, the 2022 Hurricane Fiona became the deadliest storm to batter the Canadian East. The 2021 Hurricane Ida smashed much of the U.S. state of Louisiana after running amok through the Caribbean nations such as Jamaica and Cuba. Being the most frequent target for hurricanes on the mainland U.S., the state of Florida in particular has been struck by a barrage of deadliest hurricanes over the course of the second half of the current and 7th Aquanium, such as the 2004 Hurricane Charlie, the 2004 Hurricane Ivan, the 2004 Hurricane Jean, the 2005 Hurricane Dennis, the 2005 Hurricane Wilma, the 2017 Hurricane Irma, the 2018 Hurricane Michael, and the 2022 Hurricane Ian. Likewise, Florida was also at the receiving end of some of the most devastating hurricanes to strike the mainland U.S. during the second half of the previous and sixth Aquanium, such as the 1919 Florida Keys Hurricane, the 1926 Great Miami Hurricane, the 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane, the 1933 Treasure Coast Hurricane, the 1935 Labor Day Hurricane, the 1945 Homestead Hurricane, and the 1947 Fort Lauderdale Hurricane. While Florida has also been a target for deadliest hurricanes during the first halves of the previous two Aquania according to historical records, the frequency and severity of such catastrophes has nevertheless appeared to significantly rise during the second halves. In short, the contrasting plight of Florida over the two halves of an Oqual cycle is seemingly shared by virtually all regions across the globe that are prone to being struck by hurricanes. Section 6.5 Climate Ganda. Human body is an incredibly self-sufficient machine in that it has the ability to maintain a steady state against an onslaught of daily internal and external physical-chemical perturbations. In what is technically referred to as homeostasis, such a skillful mastery serves to regulate a plethora of conditions such as body temperature, pressure, pH, and glucose. Add to that our body's ability to fight off microbial infections through a complex defense mechanism called immunity. Our body also possesses a highly versatile built-in clinic with a wide-ranging expertise to provide medical care around the clock, perform complex internal and external surgeries, and even clean up all the waste at no charge to us. To say that a healthy body heals, deals, and eats proper meals would be to put it earthly. Like our body's homeostasis, our planet is hardly dependent upon doctors to ensure its well-being. In what I call geostasis, the Earth harbors a remarkable ability to regulate its physical conditions such as temperature and pressure, as well as repair and cleanse itself by virtue of its ability to control and regulate its resources. For example, the Earth's outer atmosphere not only filters out harmful radiation from the incoming sunlight, but its magnetic field also wards off solar wind so as to prevent our planet from overheating. Additionally, extra heat produced through human activities or geological processes is suppressed by oceans through the evaporation of water, or H2O, and vice versa, such that the Earth maintains a relatively constant temperature until it transitions into a new natural climate cycle. To say that the Earth has its own thermostat that cannot be altered by anyone other than astronomical factors would be to put it warmly. Like our bodies, the Earth is also highly elastic, plastic, and fantastic in that it harbors a remarkable ability to modulate its shape to mold around physical changes such as rising sea levels due to the melting of polar ice caps. In the context of Newton's third law, it follows that for every inch in sea level rise, there is an equal and opposite rise in land mass somewhere on the planet, such that the ratio of land to sea remains more or less constant over the millennial time scale. Likewise, carbon exchange between the Earth and atmosphere is tightly regulated in what is called the carbon cycle. Carbon travels back and forth between the atmosphere and the Earth in a perpetual cycle that began billions of years ago with the formation of our planet. In fact, carbon sinks such as the topsoil, rainforests, rocks, and oceans act as buffers to regulate the atmospheric carbon dioxide, or CO2. A transient rise in atmospheric CO2 due to its release from the combustion of fossil fuels and volcanic eruptions is largely offset by the ability of carbon sinks to suck the plant staple out of the air and return it to a relatively steady state. In particular, rising levels of atmospheric CO2 are met by an equally measurable response from the oceans in that not only do they rise to the challenge and seamlessly absorb excess CO2, but they also facilitate its reaction with the calcium so as to form the insoluble calcium carbonate. After precipitating out of water, calcium carbonate serves as a building block for the synthesis of limestone on the ocean floor, and in doing so, it shifts the equilibrium away from the atmosphere so as to enable the ocean to mop up even more CO2 until a new equilibrium is established in line with Le Chatelier's principle, to which many of us are introduced during our brush with elementary chemistry in high school. Simply put, our planet is constantly in flux to ensure a relatively constant state of affairs for its diverse and colorful inhabitants. Nevertheless, like our bodies, the Earth is also vulnerable to abuse. Just as substance abuse and processed foods can wreck our health, so can our actions on the well-being of our planet. Indeed, the biggest threat to the health of our planet comes from 1. Pollution of air and water, 2. Poisoning of rivers and oceans, 3. Wrecking of rainforests, and 4. Overdraining the earth of its resources. Yet, hardly anyone is talking about such pressing issues that not only imperil our precarious health, but also bear the potential to turn our planet into a shipwreck. What is everybody talking about then? Subsection titled, Global warming is a distraction engineered to divert attention away from addressing real-world issues. Global warming is not a recent phenomenon, but rather it has been making rounds in scientific discourse for more than 2 centuries. In 1824, the French mathematician Joseph Fourier was the first to propose that the Earth's atmosphere may play a central role in attuning its surface temperature, and for his bold statement, he is often credited with the discovery of the so-called greenhouse effect, though it would not be referred to as such until the early 20th century. In 1838, the French physicist Claude Pouillet further added his weight to Fourier's greenhouse effect and even speculated that in addition to water, carbon dioxide may also be a contributing factor. In 1856, the American physicist Eunice Foote provided the first ever experimental evidence of the absorption of heat by carbon dioxide. She would also hypothesize that the rising concentration of atmospheric CO2 could change the Earth's surface temperature. In 1859, the Irish physicist John Tyndall corroborated Foote's observations, but also proposed that carbon dioxide and water in the atmosphere not only absorbed infrared radiation, but that they also radiated it back to the Earth's surface, thereby providing a complete physical basis for the first time ever of the greenhouse effect as we know it today. In 1896, the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius claimed that the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere due to the combustion of fossil fuels was concomitant with a rise in global temperature. The notion that human activities could affect terrestrial climate was, however, perceived as being nothing more than a fodder for laughs at the time, and for all intents and purposes, it should have continued to be treated as such rather than being taken seriously, for the real culprit behind our planetary woes today lies in overconsumption rather than fossil fuels. In 1901, the Swedish meteorologist Niels Ekholm used the term greenhouse for the first time ever to refer to the ability of atmospheric CO2 to act like a glass roof of a greenhouse such that it would allow sunlight through but trap the heat radiated back from the Earth's surface. In 1907, the British physicist John Poynting would, however, take the honors for having coined the term greenhouse effect to formulate the principle of the trapping of infrared radiation by atmospheric H2O and CO2. In 1938, on the back of what we now know was an expected but a transitory wave of rising temperatures in the midst of the second half of the previous Aquanium due to the cooling spell of an Oqual cycle on our planet, as demonstrated earlier, the British engineer Guy Callendar suggested that the Earth was on a persistent path to getting warmer due to the release of CO2 into the atmosphere. The notion that CO2 was the culprit behind such global warming was further picked up by the American meteorologist Charles Keeling during the 1950s. In 1958, Keeling secured the funding from the U.S. federal government to set up the so-called Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii in order to directly monitor and measure the levels of atmospheric CO2. Yet, unbeknown to Keeling the spell of an Oqual cycle on terrestrial climate, the global temperatures began to dip with the arrival of the first half of the current Aquanium, as for example underscored by the 1963 Big Freeze, the coldest winter spell witnessed on British shores in more than 200 years, and that brought the nation to a virtual standstill for months. What do you call it when the Earth starts cooling? Global cooling, of course. And you bet, it was global cooling that began to upstage global warming during much of the 1960s and 1970s, as it became the most pressing issue of those earlier times, thanks to no shortage of propagandists on hand. In fact, it would turn into a shouting match of sorts between those claiming that the melting of polar ice caps due to global warming would make the planet uninhabitable for future generations, and the others warning of a looming apocalyptic ice age due to global cooling. With the temperatures beginning to appreciably rise once more from around the 1990s, almost in parallel with the onset of the second half of the current Aquanium, global warming would understandably win the day and become the hill upon which a new wave of climate ganda would rapidly gain inertia to plunge humanity into a state of delirium from which very few have managed to escape due to the contagion of crowd psychology. Today, much of humanity has indeed been indoctrinated into believing that the looming threat of irreversible climate change or global warming is the most urgent call of our times. Masses are being fooled into buying into the bogus view that such a catastrophe knocking on our door lies in anthropogenic factors, primarily due to the release of gigatons of the so-called greenhouse gases, such as CO2, into the atmosphere each year as a result of our dependence on fossil fuels. That they ought to be alarmed at such a reckless behavior, with the world leaders not only scrambling to overhaul and pare back the use of fossil fuels, but many nations are also vowing to completely do away with them in the near future at the expense of renewable sources of energy such as sunlight and wind. Alas, The actions of world leaders only exacerbate the suffering of the people, and one would be naive to believe that their newly honed antiques represent anything but a propaganda to sell new technologies disguised as earth-friendly, even though they are the modern-day equivalent of a Trojan horse. Just as their bogus policies from economy through education to health have left the masses teetering on the precipice of a societal meltdown, the climate ganda will be equally devastating both for the planet and its inhabitants. It is therefore hardly surprising that hoi polloi are being coaxed into believing that the human society is not only fighting for its survival, but that their planet is on a tipping point, with global warming threatening to wreak havoc on their livelihoods in the very near future. Yet, the biggest threat to our planet is not from global warming, as the Earth is perfectly capable of dealing with that on its own, thanks to its innate geostatic mechanisms, but rather from the hedonistic actions and the consumer culture of the masses that puts the health of our planet in peril, and by extension our own. To add gasoline to fire, a growing number of climate scientists have also joined the chorus of politicians to inject unwarranted fear into the minds and hearts of the people through making outlandish forecasts that all but have us inching ever closer to a doomsday scenario. Unsurprisingly, such an engineered and coordinated propaganda serves as a fertile ground to attract scavengers and vultures alike, gung-ho on capitalizing on such a doom and gloom, as illustrated below via a sample of their utter all-garbage and fear-mongering having made rounds on mainstream media in the not-too-distant past.
Unless we act boldly and quickly to deal with the underlying causes of global warming, our world will undergo a string of terrible catastrophes.
People are now suffering and dying from climate change.
The Earth is in a death spiral. It will take radical action to save us. Collapse of civilization may have already begun. Our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. Around the year 2030, 10 years 252 days and 10 hours away from now, we will be in a position where we set off an irreversible chain reaction beyond human control, that will most likely lead to the end of our civilization as we know it.
Such an irresponsible and deliberate rhetoric suffices alone to paint global warming as nothing more than a hoax championed by lunatics who are more interested in changing their names to garner publicity rather than changing their lifestyles to genuinely alleviate the suffering of our planet. Worse yet, such doomsday messages play into the minds of a rising wave of mentally ill young adults who in turn adopt violent tactics that not only disrupt the vascular network necessary to maintain the blood supply to critical organs in the society, but also put others' lives at risk. Global warming as a cause for concern being championed by fools and horses, many of whom have barely broken free of their diapers rather than being in a position to understand the climate science, is a contrarian signal that the truth is the exact opposite. Global warming as the most urgent call of our times being spearheaded by hypocrites who lead a lavish lifestyle with a carbon footprint as big as that of some cities should be equally alarming. To say that such deranged souls have a political axe to grind rather than their genuine concern about saving the planet would be a huge understatement. One can be rest assured that the real-world issues that affect humanity and our planet are constantly being swept under the rug rather than making rounds in the media. As the saying goes, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Not only does climate Ganda exquisitely fit that adage, but it has also been doubled down in that the lie is about an invisible phenomenon alleged to be occurring in the stratosphere bazillions of miles away from the ground so that the masses can be kept in the dark. Not only that, but any scholar who has the spine to question the climate Ganda quickly becomes ostracized from the academic community, with no institution willing to hire them, nor any publisher prepared to lend them a platform. While climate change is inevitable and a natural consequence of the Earth's recycling and cleansing process, the hyped-up threat of global warming is nothing more than science fiction and a political weapon being used to distract humanity from paying heed to what is actually destroying our lives and the well-being of our planet, from pollution of air and water through wrecking of rainforests to pillaging the land of its resources. Does carbon dioxide not contribute to global warming? Next subsection. Carbon dioxide is a friend, not a foe. In elementary chemistry, we learned that there is an inverse relationship between the solubility of a gas in water and the ambient temperature. The higher the temperature, the lower the solubility, and vice versa. Given that our oceans act as one of the major sinks for the storage of carbon dioxide due to it being sequestered by the deep-sea cold water, as well as a breathtaking diversity of life such as phytoplankton and coral reef on the seabed, a rise in global temperature due to a natural climate cycle will be expected to unlock such oceanic carbon reservoirs and allow it to escape back into the atmosphere. In addition to the release of carbon dioxide by oceans into the atmosphere, rising temperatures also facilitate its escape from other carbon sinks such as forests and the Earth's crust through wildfires and volcanic eruptions, respectively. Add to that the fact that the rising temperatures also boost the release of carbon dioxide through an increase in respiratory activities at every level of life, from soil organisms through plants to animals. In fact, it is no coincidence that the world population has nearly octupled since the end of the Little Ice Age, from just over 1,000 million in 1850 to 8,000 million today. Such an exponential increase has not only been powered by industrialization, but perhaps more so by rising temperatures over the past 200 years. Still, no one doubts that human activities contribute to a rise in atmospheric CO2, but one cannot unequivocally argue that it is the cause of global warming. To the contrary, such a rise in atmospheric CO2 not only appears to be the effect rather than the cause of global warming as discussed earlier, but it also serves as a blessing in disguise. Not long ago, on a geological timescale, the levels of atmospheric CO2 were something to be reckoned with, and probably as high as 2 orders of magnitude greater than what they are now. Today, the atmospheric level of CO2 is closer to rock bottom than it has ever been in the long checkered history of our planet. Thus, the truth would be closer to our atmosphere being in a carbon deficit rather than carbon surplus. Not only do climate scientists have the whole picture upside down, but they are also unlikely to admit their faux pas and change direction anytime soon. Once one goes down the rabbit hole, they risk descending deeper into the wilderness rather than finding a way out. How exactly are rising levels of CO2 beneficial? A rise in atmospheric CO2 bears the potential to turn a desert into an oasis. Admittedly, rising levels of atmospheric CO2 could bring about many benefits to our planet in that they act as a fertilizer or supplement with the potential to augment plant growth through turbocharging the Kelvin cycle, the main engine of photosynthesis. In fact, many friends have confided in me that they believe that the plants have ears in that they seem to respond when being talked to. This should be hardly surprising given that plants are essentially being blasted with a puff of CO2 as one breathes next to them. While the ambient air contains a paltry 420 ppm of CO2, its concentration is 2 orders of magnitude higher at around 42,000 ppm in the exhaled air. Needless to say, I assured my friends that their observations were perfectly normal and that there was no need to see a psychiatrist, at least anytime soon. Importantly, our planet has gotten a lot greener over the past century or so thanks to the rising levels of atmospheric CO2. Yet, CO2 barely registers among the 4 major components of the dry air in the atmosphere, which in descending order are as follows: 78.08% nitrogen, 20.94% oxygen, 0.93% argon, 0.04% carbon dioxide, and 0.01% trace gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. Nevertheless, the concentration of a compound is only relative as it holds no clues vis-a-vis its effect on a particular system. Still, carbon dioxide ranks only second to water vapor as being one of the 2 major components among the greenhouse gases, with the likes of methane and nitrous oxide believed to be minor contributors to global warming. Does CO2 not contribute to the greenhouse effect? Next subsection. Greenhouse effect is too simplistic a model to account for global warming. The science upon which the notion that human activities cause global warming is predicated on a rather simplistic model as outlined below. 1. Human activities release greenhouse gases such as CO2 into the air that in turn forms a blanket-like barrier in the troposphere, the lowest layer of the atmosphere. 2. Such a barrier does not impede the incoming sunlight due to the fact that its rather small wavelength that does not interact with CO2 molecules. 3. Upon collision with the Earth's surface, the sunlight loses energy in the form of heat and is therefore reflected back into the atmosphere as infrared radiation with a much larger wavelength. And 4. Unlike the seamless entry of the sunlight reaching the Earth, much of the infrared light radiated back is absorbed by the blanket-like carbon layer in the troposphere, thereby trapping heat and warming the planet. While this so-called greenhouse effect is the basis for our planet being much warmer than it would otherwise be, due to the atmosphere acting as a blanket of sorts to trap the heat, the notion that the Earth's surface temperature can be perturbed by the release of anthropogenic greenhouse gases is largely supported by conjecture rather than hard facts. In particular, the climate scientists envision the buildup of a carbon layer in the troposphere to be analogous to the rather thick glass roof of a greenhouse. Such a preposterous assumption pours cold water over the notion that global warming is primarily the result of CO2 emissions. For example, unlike a greenhouse, the Earth's atmosphere has an infinite degrees of freedom, implying that such a plasticity can easily counteract the effect of a perturbant such as CO2 in line with Le Chatelier's principle. Nevertheless, a slightly deeper insight is warranted. While it is clear that carbon dioxide absorbs strongly in the infrared region in a manner similar to water and thus bears the potential to trap the infrared radiation reflected by the Earth's surface, The exact degree to which it contributes to global warming cannot be ascertained by even the most sophisticated tools at the disposal of climate scientists due to the complexity of so many factors contributing to atmosphere and climate. That is indeed the very reason why the climate models can barely predict the weather a week in advance with a high degree of confidence, much less a month or year from now. To argue that climate scientists have some secret tools at their disposal that can predict the climate 50 or 100 years from now is absurdity run amok to the quartic power. To add salt to their wounds, the climate scientists always seem to masquerade the fact that 0.04% of carbon dioxide in the air pales in comparison to 4% water, thereby making the latter a much more powerful greenhouse gas. To say that water is the freon or coolant of our planet that helps to maintain the Earth's surface temperature in a relatively steady state against a slew of natural and man-made activities would be a huge understatement. Other than the fact that water vapor is the elephant in the room when it comes to trapping the infrared heat radiated by the Earth's surface, courtesy of the greenhouse effect, a link between a rise in atmospheric CO2 and its impact on global temperature is almost impossible to establish. This is due to the complex relationship between changes in the surface temperature of Earth and its impact on clouds, which primarily consist of a mixture of water droplets and ice crystals trapped between dust particles suspended thousands of feet up in the sky, where the temperature is usually well below the freezing point of water. Not only do clouds play a key role in keeping our planet cool by virtue of their ability to reflect the incoming sunlight back into the outer space, but they also tend to warm it up through trapping the infrared heat radiated by the Earth's surface. Accordingly, any mitigation or augmentation of clouds triggered, for example, by the warming of the planet due to, say, a rise in atmospheric CO2 will likely compensate or offset a rise in surface temperature via a negative feedback loop. While the news that a rise in atmospheric CO2 is unlikely to be the cause of a rise in global temperature may break Russian and Canadian hearts, it should nevertheless be a huge cause for celebration by those inhabiting desert regions such as Australia, North Africa, and the Middle East, as rising levels of atmospheric CO2 bear the potential to turn the deserts into oases. Still, that should not imply that we go on a burning spree of fossil fuels, as their production and utilization comes with a huge cost on at least 4 fronts. 1. Colliery or coal mining is an environmentally destructive pursuit that wrecks natural landscapes and causes widespread pollution even before coal is shipped to power stations and industries. 2. Fracking of subterranean rocks to extract oil and natural gas is equally destructive to environment and contaminates groundwater. 3. Oil drilling in the oceans impacts marine life, and oil spillages wreak havoc on coastal communities. And 4. Combustion of fossil fuels causes air pollution and smog, which are linked with a plethora of respiratory and cardiovascular ailments, as well as many cancers. Simply put, we should cut our dependence on fossil fuels due to their harmful effects on the well-being of our planet, as well as our own lives, rather than the fact that they contribute to global warming. As discussed earlier, what appears to be a rising trend in global temperature due to the 84-year natural climate cycle oscillating in sync with the progression of Oqual cycle is being used as a propaganda to scaremonger the unsuspecting masses so as to divert attention away from addressing the real impact of fossil fuels on our lives. Is there a silver lining in our planet getting warmer? Could global warming be a manifestation of Earth waging a war on us due to our reckless behavior that amounts to nothing short of ravaging the planet? Next subsection. Global warming is a blessing in disguise rather than a death warrant. When we fall sick due to, for example, bacterial infection, our body's self-defense mechanism kicks in and responds by raising the temperature by as much as 5 degrees Fahrenheit so as to put a brake on the microbial growth. In doing so, such elevated temperature allows the body to recover lest it gets destroyed by what are often harmless parasites living in perfect harmony within our bodies and providing a useful service to us in a mutually beneficial relationship called symbiosis. In a similar manner to microbial infection, the pollution of rivers and lakes, coupled with destructive mining and deforestation driven by our consumption mania over the past century, have made the earth extremely sick, thereby triggering its innate self-defense mechanism to fight back through raising its temperature. In other words, humans are essentially akin to microbes in a symbiotic relationship with the earth being their host and as such wholly dependent on its provisions from air and water to nutrition. When we begin to cause destruction of our host faster than its ability to repair itself in a manner akin to trillions of our own parasitic microbes living within our bodies, the earth fights back with a vengeance a la our body's immune response to our own parasites when they begin to cause infection. The point being that when we ravage the planet through our reckless addiction to consumption, the earth wages a war against us through its own immunity. Notably, the combustion of fossil fuels is only one of many ways in which we pollute our environment, with overconsumption being the elephant in the room of factors contributing to the poor health of Earth. One must therefore focus on reducing their overall consumption footprint rather than merely carbon footprint to stave off the malaise affecting our planet. Decarbonization alone is nothing more than a propaganda as it diverts attention away from addressing deconsumption. Long story short, the current bout of global warming that our planet is undergoing is likely a blessing in disguise in that it appears to be a natural flux designed to recycle and repair Earth's resources as well as put its inhabitants through a stress test such that the weaker Earthlings are weeded out in a battle for the survival of the fittest through natural selection. While the global temperatures will begin to tamp down as the next aquanium rolls in over the next decade or so, it seems that the Earth is overall destined for a warmer climate in the long run in a sinusoidal manner rather than in a linear fashion as the bogus climate models claim. Nevertheless, such global warming appears to be far from being a death warrant as it is likely to be a zero-sum game, wherein one's loss is another's gain. While tropical and subtropical countries would be the biggest losers in the face of such global warming, nations with a continental climate such as Canada and Russia stand to enormously benefit. This is due to the fact that the ice caps in such nations would become exposed to sunlight for the first time in perhaps a millennium, so as to not only provide a new arable land for agriculture and trade, but also compensate for the loss of tropical land becoming submerged underwater or turning into a desert of sorts. Additionally, forbidden regions such as Antarctica and Greenland could become the new worlds and beacons of hope for people from all over the globe, particularly those escaping the brunt of the heat in the tropics. Tellingly, the threat of global warming has been unnecessarily hyped up by 1. Climate scientists who are primarily charged with looking into the impact of human activities on climate rather than natural causes. They therefore have the incentive to keep the poorly defined connective tissue between climate and human activities alive and kicking, lest they kill the goose that lays the golden egg. 2. corrupt policymakers who stoke up interest in their propaganda through injecting fear so as to maintain a control over the masses and enact new laws favorable to their political interests. 3. Serial fraudsters who see an opportunity to make a killing on introducing new technologies to consumers using the cliché of environment-friendly renewable energy as a gimmick. And 4. Gullible fanatics who hold climate rallies and protests so as to be seen as good doers, all the while continuing to lead a reckless lifestyle through maintaining an unnecessarily large carbon footprint. Why technologies dubbed environment-friendly, such as electric cars and solar panels, are anything but? Are they just an enterprise driven by monetary greed? Next subsection. Capitalist economy and environmental well-being are mutually exclusive. Due to the melting of polar ice caps and glaciers, large swaths of land in regions such as Greenland are becoming exposed and habitable for the first time in millennia. While such regions have hitherto kept the destructive force of humanity at bay, they are now rapidly garnering the attention of billionaires. Such fraudsters are targeting to ravage these new lands through financially backing mining companies that promise to dig up the hills and valleys in search of metals such as nickel and cobalt needed to power up electric vehicles. That should set off alarm bells. Not only are electric vehicles no more earth-friendly than their gasoline counterparts, but mining itself is extremely harmful to the environment as it not only destroys natural habitats but also pollutes the planet. In other words, the democratization of electric vehicles is largely driven by the greed of the wealthy rather than their genuine concern for the well-being of the planet and its inhabitants. Little such fraudsters understand that the best defense against the destruction of our environment is cutting down on consumption, not promoting it. As the saying goes, what is good for the goose is good for gander. What is good for the wealthy is good for their stakeholders. Indeed, the governments have been a party to the bogus electric revolution from the very beginning, as they always are with every fraud, since their actions are essentially a manifestation of the interests of the wealthy. Yet, the real threat to our planet is not global warming, but overconsumption that has made our planet so sick. One should therefore be talking about reining in our reckless consumption mania that turned parabolic just as the second half of the current millennium kicked off. Thanks but no thanks to a quantum leap in the mass production of electronic goods, from personal computers through smartphones to digital cameras. We must therefore pare back our consumer-driven lifestyles, for they are rapidly condemning our lonely planet to a future of misery. No one in their right mind would disagree that pumping gigatons of toxic gases into atmosphere would be met with no consequences on our health and that of our environment in one way or another. Likewise, pumping gigatons of toxic waste into our lakes and oceans annihilates our ecosystems upon which our well-being is so dependent. Ditto for dumping gigatons of toxic waste on land, for it not only adds to air pollution, but more importantly, toxic chemicals ultimately leach into nearby streams and rivers, thereby endangering our health through contamination of food chains. No one should be surprised that finding a reliable source of uncontaminated drinking water and healthy food has become next to impossible across most parts of the world today. Notably, the burden of living with pollution largely created by Western nations often falls on poor countries. In what is called e-waste, millions of tons of old and obsolete electronic gadgets generated each year in Western nations are shipped to developing countries to be dumped there. The poor nations are thus not only made to face the brunt of fallout from the resulting pollution of such electronic waste, but the young children are also exploited to scour through such dangerous heaps of waste in order to recycle metals such as copper and gold. Yet, rather than enacting policies to reduce our consumption and eliminate exploitation of the weak around the globe, the lawmakers do the exact opposite. They encourage grandmothering out or replacing an old technology with a new one through not only marketing it as an environment-friendly product, but also providing tax credits to those who are willing to go to bed with them. For example, electric cars have been hyped up as a savior of our environment, yet few understand that they likely pose greater risk to our livelihoods than their gasoline counterparts due to the fact that the rather inefficient batteries that power them up will have to be constantly disposed of onto landfills, with the potential for the toxic chemicals to drain into nearby rivers and ultimately end up in our food chains. A typical battery in an electric car weighs around half a ton, with the deadly toxic metals such as lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt accounting for at least 10% of their weight. Add to that conundrum the fact that most proponents of electric cars do not even realize that the power upon which they run does not fall from the sky, but rather such electric devils in disguise merely shift the pollution from one's neck of the woods to the power station. In fact, the real culprit in vehicular emissions is not carbon dioxide, but rather nitrogen oxides, which are largely responsible for air pollution, including smog. While vehicular emissions are a major contributor to the total nitrogen oxides released into the atmosphere, the coal-fired power plants are not far behind. The electric cars that ultimately rely on such plants are therefore hardly any more environment-friendly than their gasoline counterparts. Simply put, electric cars are wolves in sheep's clothing that do not in any meaningful way reduce the carbon footprint that so many fools are trying to break free of so that they can lay claim to the ill-conceived view that their actions are no longer harmful to the environment. Yet, an electric car only serves to exacerbate the pain and agony of our environment and hence our own lives. The only viable path to reducing our carbon footprint is to simply reduce our consumption rather than shift it from one bogus consumer product to another in the misguided belief that one's new lifestyle is more environment-friendly. Donne-moi un break. Like electric cars, solar panels are no guardian angels either, in that their electronic components also stand to pose a huge risk to the environment at the end of their shelf life when they are dumped onto a landfill, with the potential for carcinogens such as lead and cadmium to seep into nearby rivers and lakes. To say that solar waste outweighs any benefits of solar energy would be to put it without mincing words. Many pundits peddle the naivete that the only solution to the well-being of our planet is to create cleaner energy through scientific breakthroughs. Yet, such fools fail to understand that every technological breakthrough inherently comes with a pre-packed dose of undesirable secondary effects. Never in our history have we ever created a perfect technology that is solely beneficial to us and our environment without any side effects, not to mention that such a hypothetical machine would violate the laws of physics. The take-home message is that no technology is good for the well-being of the environment and, by extension, our own health. Ni electric cars, ni solar panels, ni windmills, not even nuclear fusion. Yes, you heard that right. Although it is not clear at this stage, but to argue that nuclear fusion is unlike any other technology with zero waste products would be to violate the inviolable Newton's third law. The extraction of the rather scarce helium from natural gas to fuel fusion reactors could, for instance, offset its benefits. One simply cannot have an action without an equal and opposite reaction. Accordingly, the only way to protect our environment is through the old-fashioned way of being frugal and cutting down on consumption. Rather than exploiting the hyped-up threat of global warming as a scaremongering tactic to advance their political propaganda, the policymakers ought to pass legislations that outlaw environment-unfriendly consumer products such as disposable plastics, papers, cardboards, and metals, coupled with levying heavy taxation on toxic technologies such as driving and flying, so as to encourage hoi polloi to adopt more environment-friendly lifestyles. While such a move would undoubtedly destroy the capitalist economy, it would be a godsend for the well-being of our environment. Driven by the propaganda of getting the masses hooked on unnecessary and toxic products, as well as to keep them enslaved through indoctrinating them into adopting a lifestyle of living paycheck to paycheck, the capitalist economy and the environmental well-being are indeed mutually exclusive. As much as the masses and their masters would like to have the cake and eat it too, that is simply not possible given the fact that their consumer-driven lifestyles will forever continue to wreck the planet unless capitalism is reined in so as to prioritize environmental health over detrimental wealth. To say that it is primarily the capitalists fueling the climate-ganda would be to put it lightly, though my French friends are somewhat more philosophical. Le renard dans le poulailler. The fox is guarding the henhouse. One cannot indeed have the fox guard the henhouse and then reassure the poor chickens that their safety is the top priority. What about the consensus view on global warming? Next subsection. The majority happens to be always wrong due to herd behavior. Gullible fanatics defend the hyped-up threat of global warming by playing the consensus card. That there is a unanimous consensus among climate scientists that global warming is directly due to human activities. Yet, history has time and again shown that socio-political causes driven by a consensus view have often plunged the human society into a turmoil due to the fact that they are often the product of conflict of interest, confirmation bias, and herd mentality rather than hard facts. The proof of my proclamation lies in the centuries-old pudding as illustrated below via a quartet of botched and bungled policies. 1. Up till as recently as the 18th century, the consensus among Western intellectuals of the bygone era was that the superiority of the white race justified the enslavement of the blacks and the colonization of others. The results of such a bogus philosophy are all clear for us to see today, as it not only left an indelible mark on our past, but also destroyed so many indigenous societies and cultures, and with them the loss of so much diversity on our planet. 2. In the late 19th century, in what came to be called eugenics, the much respected intellectuals of those times across the Western world spearheaded the propaganda of turning humanity into a super race through selective breeding of individuals judged to be fit, all the while sterilizing others deemed unfit. Not only would such a racist theory be abused for the genetic selection of the elite rather than biologically fit, but it would also lead to the loss of genetic diversity through direct interference with natural selection, as it came to a grinding halt before too long. 3. In the 20th century, the likes of nutritionists, physicians, media, and even the federal government in the United States were unanimous in declaring that the lipids or fats were our enemy number one and that they must be eliminated from our diet even when they were known to be the basic building blocks of life. Not only did such a bogus ideology lead to a spike in health issues from obesity to diabetes among his disciples due to the lack of a balanced diet, but the promoters of such a sham and scam also stayed mum on the toxicogenic effects of processed foods, the real culprits contributing to poor health. After the low-fat scam fell on his face, the consensus later moved onto the low-carb diet, even though carbohydrates are the preferred fuel needed to power up a healthy body. Today, the fools are once again being herded into the so-called protein-rich diet, which is extremely unhealthy as it can send liver and kidneys into an overdrive with the increased risk of organ failure. And 4. In the 21st century, in the wake of the 2019 coronavirus pandemic, epidemiologists the world over reached a consensus that the best way to curb the pathogen was through the implementation of wholesale lockdowns and shuttering of the economic engine across the globe. Not only did such a preposterous mandate send the society into a tailspin, with the masses going into hiding and isolating themselves out of apprehension, even when in desperate need of medical care or otherwise, but the disproportionate fear injected into society likely killed far more people than the coronavirus itself. Not to mention that the resulting chaos also decimated the economic engine as well as adding gasoline to the socio-political fire that has all but snowballed into a complete societal meltdown. Why was this strategy as self-destructive as the lockdowns implemented? Was there a malicious intention behind such mandates ordered across the globe? The goat herder, or rather the philosopher in me, has this to say. 1. During hard times against the backdrop of a growing socio-political upheaval, and in particular during Oqual winters, as was the case for the 2020 lockdowns that transpired at the outset of the Oqual winter of the current Aquanium, those in charge of calling the societal shots often lose their head in that every new step that they take to mend the wound actually happens to be the exact opposite of what they ought to have done. In lay terms, panicking during a troublesome situation only serves to exacerbate it. Simply put, our leaders might have had good intentions in implementing what they did, but their ignorance of the dire spell of an Oqual cycle planted their downfall. 2. Not all of our leaders may be so innocent vis-a-vis the 2020 lockdowns in that those in the positions of power are far from being normal people conforming to the live and let live doctrine, but rather they are born to rule over others, and as a part of their authoritative psyche, they are often driven by the urge to control the sheep through injecting fear a la sheepdog. Such a despicable behavior on the part of our leaders may arise either due to their urge to test the waters to see how much power they can exercise over their sheep, or due to the capitalist greed to introduce new draconian laws under the veneer of fear, which otherwise may draw the ire of the public. Had it not been for a disproportionate amount of fear injected into the masses through the lockdowns, measures such as mandatory vaccination to add to the transition to conducting business and personal affairs online by leaps and bounds in the wake of the 2019 coronavirus pandemic would have undoubtedly failed to materialize. And 3. With the cure being multiples worse than the pandemic itself, and with an opportunity of a lifetime to make a killing on introducing new technologies and health measures, the capitalists with malicious intentions quickly jumped onto the political bandwagon and added their weight to a growing chorus of officials calling for the 2020 lockdowns. If this amounts to a sort of conspiracy behind the implementation of the lockdowns, as many people are led to believe, then so be it. However, what is clear is that the wealth of capitalists has since bloated by trillions thanks to the lockdowns, all the while the masses have been left in even deeper waters than they have ever been in their lives. So, what gives? With a 20/20 hindsight of how a consensus view has often destroyed societies and nations, the popular belief that the ongoing global warming is irreversible and solely caused by anthropogenic factors will also come to be seen as a blunder of the millennium by as early as 2050, but by no later than 2100. Not only that, but we should be more concerned about our planet plunging into another mini ice age over the next couple of centuries rather than getting roasted by heat. In the meantime, let us cherish the fact that heat is a real treat, for it powers our lives in contrast to cold that kills. In summary, science is never settled, nor is it based on consensus or preponderance, and as such, 1. The rise in global temperature witnessed over the past several decades is most likely due to an 84-year natural climate wave that will soon begin to plateau out before it heads south, more or less in sync with the start of the next Oqual cycle in 2039. 2. While human activities may have exacerbated the amplitude of such a climate wave, the major culprit appears to be overconsumption rather than the rise in atmospheric CO2. 3. The apparent rise in atmospheric CO2 witnessed over the past couple of centuries is most likely the effect rather than the cause of global warming. 4. Combustion of fossil fuels should be pared back because they cause environmental pollution rather than their impact on global warming. And 5. Demonization of fossil fuels amounts to nothing but a propaganda spearheaded by the wealthy to introduce new technologies dubbed environment-friendly, even though they constitute nothing short of a Trojan horse with the potential to ratchet up the destruction of the planet like never before.